Welcome everyone to seminar number 203. And again, we're with the topics of students and governance. So we've had quite a few webinars on governance and we have more to come. But students, I think, are a really interesting topic, and especially now where there seems to be some sort of upsurge in agency and its expression among students, and perhaps that's about the conditions of the pandemic, but perhaps it's always there. It's getting more recognition at the moment, and today's webinar will assist with that process and take us forward on understanding it. And we've got Rille, Raaper and Janja Komljenovic with us to take us through that topic. But before I introduce Rille and Janja, let me take you through the webinar protocols. Remember that the webinar is being recorded and will be posted online on our CGHE website and will be on YouTube within 48 hours or so. We'll also post the chat from the webinar, which is often very interesting as well. Now, please keep yourself muted during the webinar unless you've been asked to speak or you're in the Q&A and asking a question. There's no need to have your video on during the webinar, but please turn it on if you can when you're asking a question. We recommend using the speaker view setting in Zoom so you can more clearly see who is talking at any given time. Now, to ask a question, put it first into the chat in written form, and I'll compose the Q&A list on the basis of what's coming in on the chat. So two things to think about when you're developing a question or making a statement. Make sure it's relevant to, and sharply relevant if you can, to what's being said in the presentation, and also do so early in the process. We find that people coming in with great comments and questions in the last 5-10 minutes tend to miss out on the Q&A list because it's already full. But if you bring your question or your statement forward towards the end of the presentation or just after that, your chances of being part of the discussion are very high. Now, when you're invited to ask your question in the Q&A, don't forget to unmute yourself and turn on your video, and you start by telling us who you are and where you are from. Well, a pleasure to now introduce our webinar presenters today. Rille Raaper is an associate professor in sociology of higher education in the School of Education at Durham University, and Durham folk have appeared on our webinar program more than once and made major contributions to our discussions. She specialises in student identity, experience and agency in marketised higher education settings. No lack of empirical material in the UK for that. And she's conducted projects. We won't do the full list of her projects and publications, but you can obtain more information about her work, of course, by writing directly to her. Janja Komljenovic is a CGHE researcher, a frequent contributor to our program, to our webinar program, and we think an important emerging researcher in the field of higher education studies. She's a lecturer in higher education at Lancaster University. Her research focuses on higher education marketisation and forms of markets, market making, the diversity and complexity of markets in and around universities, including the devices and the actors. She's especially interested in the digital economy and phenomena like digitalisation, datification and platformisation of universities. Interesting that platformisation is spelt with a Z, but digitalisation is spelt with an S, so she spans the whole Anglo-American world in her studies. She's published widely in these areas and on a range of matters concerned with higher education policy. But you will now hear much more about Rille and Janja, and I'm happy to hand over at this point to Rille, who will, I think, share her slides with us.
Thank you. I'm just going to do that now.
Yes, we can see that.
Yes, that's great. And thank you very much for such a warm welcome. Janja and myself are delighted to be here and to share some of our work around the changing role of students in British university governance. And the plan is that I will make a start, highlighting some of the context and introducing some of the lines of arguments. And then I'll pass on the word to Janja. And obviously, Janja, whenever you want to step in, feel free to do so. But interestingly, our work today, or our presentation today, draws on our very kind of recent discussions, conversations, and ongoing co-writing that we've had over the year. So it's really, really nice to be able to share some of those lines of arguments with you today and receive your feedback on that as well. So it's very much part of a paper that we have been writing together. But what we do today is that we want to then trace and problematize the changing role of students in British higher education governance over the 3 societal periods. I'll come to those time periods in a moment. But why we want to do that is, I think, it's always important to question that why we're looking into anything or why we're discussing certain topics. That first of all, obviously, it's incredibly important to problematize those changes, as they can tell us quite a bit about the changing purpose of higher education in the kind of, socioeconomic changes. And secondly, it's also really interesting to question and think about the student role in governance, as it can tell us quite a bit about how meaningful it is and how meaningful it has been over time and how it's changing as well. That if we speak about students as stakeholders or students as important partners, then what do we mean by that and how that has changed over time? So what we wanted to do, or what we're doing here today, is we're kind of walking you through 3 key time periods that we have chosen for this analysis. And obviously they're to a certain extent artificial. Any periodization is a bit problematic as we come to, but it helps us to think about some of those changes. So we start with the welfare state, which starts after the Second World War broadly, and we look into the societal and economic changes within that in relation to student role. We move on then to market society, which we kind of start looking into from the oil crisis in mid-70s and within that neoliberal ideology emerging from that. And then we move on to where Janja particularly steps in when we look into the contemporary digital economy, which we have kind of started as when the kickoff of 2008 financial crisis and kind of emerging from that. But nevertheless, we're not arguing that there are no overlaps. Of course there are, and the shifts from one to another are not set in stone or fixed. So keep that in mind, and we'll keep reminding you that as well. But that's the plan. And then just to start with a little bit about the field of higher education governance and student role within that. Whenever you look at the scholarship around that, or if you look into the actual practical ways of students to be involved in higher education governance, it's incredibly messy. It's a very messy field. And first of all, there are lots of different ways in which students could be involved in higher education governance, or at least influence decision-making. And researchers looked into student representation in governing bodies, whether they're university councils or senates or what else, depending on particular systems, or course level representation. Then my own work and work of Rachel Brooks has looked into students' unions and their role in quality assurance and the role in governance through that. Then obviously some of the more recent ways and the kind of diffuse and perhaps a little bit messier ways, which are to do with student satisfaction surveys, which also feed into this decision making. Then digital data, which we come to, metrics, and then of course consumer complaints procedures and all those kinds of ways through which students can inform decision making. And then in addition to those different ways of being involved, there are also competing purposes. And I'm not even sure we have actually agreed or whether it's even essential to agree what the purpose of student role in higher education governance is as such. But what we can see that there are those competing purposes for sure. There are arguments to be made around democratic functioning of universities. And if students, the largest population on campus, doesn't have a say over higher education governance, then probably something is wrong within the system. So those democratic ideas around governance. But then we, of course, have also consumerist, forces within that. And again, fairly so probably, if students are paying, particularly in the UK context and English context, so high fees, then it seems kind of reasonable that they have some say over the decision making. So there are those competing purposes, and it is a messy field. And in some ways, we can see that from the daily practice when we see the calls for students to become course representatives or to complete those various satisfaction surveys, or constantly being reminded how they can make their voice heard through consumer rights you know, the consumer rights. The leaflet here is from the Consumer Markets Authority that regulates the student rights as consumers. And then I have an example here also from the students being reminded how the data is collected and shared and processed. So what a variety of ways in which student input is collected. And these are not all inclusive here, of course. Now, then if we speak about periodization and just a little bit of saying that it's not an easy task to try to categorize anything. And I think, you know, we need to be cautious of that and reflective of that. But in order to see some change or some kinds of, you know, dominance of certain discourses, it's sometimes quite useful to try to do that. And what we try to argue here, why we are taking this route is, you know, particularly drawing on Robert Troschitz's work here around how looking into different, you know, if we want to understand student role in society or in higher education governance, then working around those different periodizations would help us to understand that as a site of contestation, where then those different societal and economic and political forces struggle for hegemony at a particular time. And they clearly produce some sort of dominant you know, idea of student in higher education governance. And I think that's what we try to do with those, looking into what are those dominant, you know, narratives then around or purposes around student involvement. So that's where we are. I don't know, Janja, if you have anything to say here, or I'll move on to the first time period, which we then start as the welfare state, which then starts after or broadly starts after the Second World War. And this whole idea of the strong state and the state input and state role in governing and influencing both social and economic life. And this whole idea of rebuilding the state and societal stability after the big war. And you know, people would argue that the UK became kind of a welfare pioneer within the field. And if you look into some of those initiatives and reforms that took place, then it's probably fair to say so. That Education Act, for example, setting the compulsory schooling to 15 and making secondary schools free of charge. Then looking into some of those Family Allowances Act or National Insurance Act, which put in place a variety of protective measures for retirement or ill health or unemployment. And then, of course, National Health Service, perhaps the biggest, you know, reform and celebration of the time as such. So there was a lot of that kind of progressiveness within that in terms of social welfare. And within that context, obviously, the global you know, economic movement as well, which comes through the Bretton Woods Agreement, particularly regulating some of that international collaboration and setting those global parameters for working together. And then within that context, of course, then the sense of solidarity emerges, and there's no surprise of looking into collective organizing and the increase in trade unions membership. So that's all kind of that broadly describes the you know, the period. Obviously, it's a little bit romantic you know, perspective, but it helps us to understand the role of universities within that. And we could argue easily, or people argue, that within such context, higher education could be seen more or less as a public and social good that then fits within that economic social narrative. And of course, universities were not widely accessible to general population at the time. I think it was about 5% participation rate in early 60s for young people in UK higher education. But that also fed into this widening participation discourse that then kicked off with Robbins' report in 63 particularly, and led into new types of plate class universities and an open university to be established. And this aspiration for higher education, something that is part of social mobility and collective good. And when we look into funding mechanism, then obviously strong state funding or public funding into sector, which started to drop as, you know, soon as student numbers started to increase. But anyway, the element of public funding and then the academic freedom and autonomy through those governing decisions. So that's broadly the context. So now looking into the student role within that context, because what we want to do here is to look into how the student then became the partner within the higher education governance, more or less. And what we know, looking into, you know, existing research and archivic material, there was very little evidence of student involvement in any kind of higher education decision making here before 60s. And yes, some students, societies, pressure groups, newspapers that try to have an influence, but no kind of formal way of student representation. And also a scholarship looks into 1960s, particularly 68 student rebellion and demonstration as something that protest change, and students exercising within that mentality that promoted collectiveness and collective action, exercised that agency and fought for some of those representative functions. And you know, if we speak about even grants or other contexts, that, you know, the students were not necessarily happy with the conditions they were studying, not fitting into lecture theatres and things like that. And as a result of those revolts and movements, we can see some elements of representative governance emerging, where students became partners within those university governing bodies. At least they got some seats in it and had that formal place within that. But then, without being romantic about that, we also have to question about what the implications of that are. And there's plenty of questions being raised whether some of that representative governance then kind of silences opportunities for future activism. And that's also important to keep in mind. But that's where we are now with the first time period. But moving on to the second one, which then is the market society within that kind of neoliberal logic, more or less. You know, when we look into that, we start from the 73, 74 oil crisis in particular, but then obviously leading into 79 and onwards, Margaret Thatcher coming to power, Ronald Reagan in power in the US, and various financial and economic crises within that time period. But first of all, what we can see within that economic or political order is the questioning of the Keynesian welfare state. It became too expensive, it didn't work, and that's led into this new political platforms in a way. And within that context, that neoliberal ideology emerges, that's where the shift from welfare provision and state taking care of the people in need, the shift to the personal responsibilization and personal responsibility for one's well-being, for one's work, for one's unemployment, and things like that. And from that context, obviously, questions around whether even having everybody's employment is a desirable aim. Probably not, because unemployment becomes productive in terms of enforcing competition and all this casualization of the workforce and things like that. And that obviously has implications for public attitudes and shift from that collective mentality towards more of the individual responsibility. And that reflects again in the reduction of the trade union membership that nearly dropped half in the UK context during that time. And within the global setting, we witness a lot of financial liberalization, so moving away from collective agreements to letting markets do their job and letting markets to regulate. And in that context, what we then see the purpose of higher education changing as well, and becoming more or less of human capital development, which then enforces that particular type of economic order. But also higher education becoming a global industry, where then if the public funding drops or reduces for the sector, then it becomes about universities being in competition to increase the funding for its existence. And we see the tuition fee increase, which I don't think we need to speak about much, but from the Ealing report in 1998, from £1,000 to 3,000 in 2004, I think, and then onwards tripling to 9,000 in 2012. 13. So clearly putting that responsibility to the individual. And when we look into governance more broadly, we see lots of competing forces, whether it's to do with public and private interest. Are universities public institutions? Yes, Privy Council and some of the legal frameworks. Most of the UK universities are public institutions, but then are they operating based on private interest? Probably also true. And then what Colin McCaig would speak about, looking into changes in the UK higher education governance, this shift away from efficiency and accountability to very complex processes related to managing risks, managing consumption and consumer rights, managing competition and things like that. So it has become a messy field. So what does that now mean for students? We can see that students, which is nothing surprising as such, have been constructed as consumers, and through those Consumer Rights Act particularly, and then those rights that come through that act. And we can then question the role of student in higher education as something that relates to consumer power and having that right to be represented within quality assurance as a fee-paying consumer or customer. But in addition to that visible increase in student representation in governance as such, governing bodies, we can also see lots of market tools emerging in capturing student voice and feeding into governance through that. And satisfaction surveys, league tables, various mobile apps, the digital starts coming in, of course, and that also feeds into higher education governance through that. So what we can say is that we have those tensions emerging here between the visibility of student power, incredibly visible, the student voice, students in various roles that could be considered as part of governance. But then the question of, is it tokenistic? For what purposes does it exist? And it becomes more about transaction and what we try to argue here. But I'll let Janja to take over now with the digital aspect.
Yes, thank you very much, Rille, and also Simon for the wonderful introduction. So I will now continue with the current period of the so-called digital economy. If you can click, Rille. Where we actually see yet another important change in the global economy more broadly and in the British economy more specifically. And these changes can be marked by the processes of financialization and rentership, where in financialization we mean a set of layered processes, and at the macro level, it means that the majority of the economic output is in fact coming from financial product services and derivatives, but then also financial instruments penetrating more traditional sectors, including production, and also having impact on individual citizen subjectivities as small-scale financial investors and so on. So that's one important side of it, and this is all coordinated not through the processes of commodification and production, but through the processes of so-called rentership. By this, we mean that the economic benefit comes from owning and controlling assets. And Brad Christopher's analyzes, in particular, the British state as the global leader in the rentier economy, where he identifies 7 types of different rents that exist out there. And they are financial rents, natural resource rents, intellectual property, contract, so outsourcing service, big infrastructure, land, of course, and finally, digital platforms. So digital platforms are also coordinated and governed with the principle of rentership, and they are essentially protected as assets through intellectual property rights, such as copyright and patents. So importantly, especially from 2008 onwards, we see a change that, particularly if you look through market capitalization, that 7 out of 8 top global companies work with the business model relying on digital platforms. We also see big shifts, and tech companies working with platforms getting unprecedented power and central focus globally. So just think about the tech giants that were already existing before and gain momentum now, or like Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and so on, but then also new platforms that emerged around the financial crash of 2008 or a bit after, like Uber, Airbnb, Spotify, and now in higher education, we have higher education or education specific platforms that are emerging very aggressively. So the question here is, how does this change the value and where the value lies? And the important part of that is, of course, the digital data and big data and value coming out of the data. But just what does this actually mean? Because initially people predicted that raw or small data would be traded so that there would be markets emerging where data would be bought and sold. And this didn't really happen beyond the fact that data brokering industry, which existed before, got a little bit bigger and sophisticated. But other than that, digital data is made valuable in many different ways. Importantly, it needs to be collected aggregated, then analyzed and turned into intelligence. And only then it can become valuable to either develop existing products or innovate new products or manipulate whole populations. Katarina Pistor, a legal scholar based in US, even goes further to say that digital data is a funny phenomena, because on the one hand, it's not raw data, it's not rivalrous. It has zero marginal cost for reproduction, but what is rivalrous are algorithms and intelligence products, and where value actually lies is in influencing people's behaviors and nudging behavior. In terms of work, the economy changed substantially as well. So we see the rise of so-called gig work with precarization of workers' rights. So just to say that in the UK specifically, before the pandemic, in the study led by University of Hertfordshire, together with international trade unions, they found that in the UK, work done on digital platforms or mediated by digital platforms doubled between 2016 and 19. And in 2019, it amounted to almost 10% of workers in the country to do gig work at least once a week. Majority of those workers were young people between 16 and 33, and they were mostly topping up income or producing combinations of income. So for example, renting rooms or Airbnb while also being delivery for food drivers and so on. So there's substantial shifts happening there. At the same time, we obviously see increasing number of people taking on digital types and forms of education. Obviously now with COVID, this is even extrapolated to everyone, but it is a trend happening already before. And we are turned into digital workers, learners, consumers, subjects, and so on, where our homes and environments are all turned smart and connecting into the Internet of Things. I should also mention the geopolitical dimension here, where the digital economy is very uneven, with the biggest competitors by far being China and US. EU is trying to up their game here, and UK is the biggest player in the European sphere, but it is a very important characteristic of what is emerging here.
Yep. Greatest day of my life.
So what that means for universities is that as the whole digital economy, the whole economy and society is being digitalized, so are universities. So on the one hand, universities have digitalized their operations and they mostly work with proprietary platforms, although they may develop their own as well. So we are seeing these big ecosystems of digital infrastructures being now implemented across the sector with very diverse kind of functions, ownership rights, and so on, and all kind of modules being connected together. So one of the straight effects that we see is so-called unbundling of education. Maybe we can think about this in two ways. So one is cutting down longer degrees into shorter forms of delivery, but the other thing is also unbundling of the provision, so that it's not only universities who would offer all of the programs together, but they might offer it in partnerships with private companies. So we will now see the image developed by the research project done by colleagues from University of Leeds and Cape Town, where they were tracing partnerships between universities and OPM companies, so online program management platform companies, where they form partnerships with universities to deliver online degrees across the world for very high tuition fees. And we can see that this is a very uneven space here, because they prefer to work with Russell Group universities, so the university reputation and brand matters very much. This then kind of questions this whole idea of democratization potential of digital education, because it's in fact highly privatized and expensive and stratified as well. So at the same time, we see a kind of parallel or alternative universe emerging through so-called micro-credentials, boot camps, which are very intense, short periods of skills and knowledge, skills training and knowledge kind of dissemination, building stackable degrees. And here, quite interestingly, we see a change in MOOC providers towards almost becoming OPMs and allowing universities to construct their degrees in this stackable way, as well as the emergence of peer-to-peer learning platforms where anybody basically can present kind of lectures or modules and then monetize and disseminate through the platform. So we see kind of these new lifelong learning networked opportunities, but at the same time, importantly, also a rise of certificating this kind of knowledge dissemination as well, so that it also becomes in a way verified and people have proof to it. Potentially this might challenge universities as having monopolies legally and legitimately of certifying acquired knowledge, so that this is now done by these kind of alternative agents. These platforms allow universities to extend their markets geographically so that they can reach more students around the world without them having to move, but then also in the variety of provision, as mentioned, in the form and in the content as well. There is big push towards the idea of employability. So employability, we've seen, was really important already in the previous period, but now it's even more emphasized, where technology is supposed to enable sort of just-in-time delivery of education and allow this sort of skills matching, where we would be digital workers and lifelong learners, but at the same time, we should kind of step in and out of learning as we work. So digital skills here are promoted as really important. And universities quite keenly work with private actors to be involved in these new kinds of provision, and also thinking about how to govern all this. That means that universities collect an unprecedented amount of digital data. Now, Happy did a study at the end of 2019. Sorry, that's not the right study. Happy did a study at the end of 2019, where they found that most of the students don't really know which their personal data is collected or what it's used for. And in terms of what they think, they don't necessarily mind their personal data being processed for making the teaching and learning processes better, but they do mind it for if it's used for commercial reasons. So that's quite interesting. In terms of extending higher education markets, this is a screenshot of the new report that was just published a few weeks ago by JISC, the sectorial body in the UK supporting digitalization, together with Emerge Education, who is a seed investor in education technology in the UK, about so-called future of revenue diversification in higher education. There, the biggest problem faced by universities in the UK is presented to be financial instability. So the idea is that universities are in financial crisis and they need to find new sources of revenue, which is not from the public budget, so reversing back on tuition fees, but universities should find new and, importantly, digital ways of earning more income. So they propose 6 yes, next image. They propose 6 ways of how they can do that, and that's again a screenshot from that report. If we now, so basically what happens now with all of this data that universities collect from, well, not only students, also staff, but let's focus on students here. This is now what we are kind of experimenting in our thoughts and interpretation. And we want to differentiate between governing with data and governing of data. So when we think about governing with data, First, we should say that governing with numbers is not entirely new phenomena. So Nicholas Rose analyzed carefully centuries worth of work, how actors in power actually use numbers to govern their subjects. So there is this combination between quantification and democratic governance. But what is new here is just the amount of data, the detail of data and granularity that is present now in the sector. So Williamson analyzes carefully here the development of the national data infrastructure that involves also private actors at the policy level, how to imagine this digital infrastructure at the system level, but then also how to implement this. And we can think about this even as extra statecraft, where infrastructure actually sets the invisible rules that govern the spaces. So in this sense, we can see that the trend from before, this kind of that Rille was talking about, the visibility of students and numbers and so on, being really intensified with the potential of technology here, where various intelligence products, including business and learning analytics, are now thought to be important elements of how we do things at universities. Quality assurance is also changing, where we see stepping back of relying on sort of peer reviews and relying on professional kind of knowledge towards, again, numbers and instant numbers. We also see merging of databases at the national level, with the example here being Leo database, so information about employment now being included in the market information tools for future students on deciding where and what to study. So in a sense, we could say that technology kind of intensifies this marketization, but students might still be seen as important stakeholders to some extent. Things become much messier when we think about the governance of data. And here it is first is important to note the infrastructure ecology that I mentioned before in terms of the nestedness of these policies and platforms. So while higher education is still governed with the public law, we also see at the same time this kind of emergence of contractual governance. So when universities engage with particular digital platforms, they negotiate contracts. Universities would still be responsible for the personal student data they collect, but in the contracts they can determine how these private companies that own platforms get to process this data. And the other element of that is the relationship then between the platform owners and students directly, because terms and conditions still apply of those particular platforms that are unilaterally issued by them alone. So this is a far more complex story that, that we can discuss if there are any questions about this. But what happens in practice is that we as users, as university kind of stakeholders, need to comply with layers of contractual kind of demands that we might not even be aware of. I mean, if somebody looks into it, they can find some information, but as a typical user, research shows people don't read these texts. Now, universities do have to, in the UK, at least the legislation at the moment, still complies with the GDPR, which might change now with Brexit, but nevertheless, GDPR kind of sorts the vertical relation between the individual and the company owner in terms of understanding data as an extension of selves and civil rights and privacy rights. The problem here is that it only regulates the identifiable personal data and not that metadata that is not identifiable, where a lot of aggregated value actually lies. And the second problem is that it doesn't really regulate the horizontal nature that is important in various analytical processes. So it's not terribly supportive, I should say, of the challenges and problems that rentiership and assetization actually bring. Connie with colleagues found in the US study, so they did a study at the in the time of COVID, when universities were relying so much on various platforms to deliver emergency teaching, that there's a big inconsistency in practice. So a particular platform might have different conditions for different universities as well. So between platforms, between universities, and this might have important consequences. So I've already mentioned the vertical and horizontal nature of the data governance that is important here, but just to say that the big question here is where the locus of power at the aggregated data actually lies. So who gets to access, use, and then actually innovate with the data that is collected? What we want to suggest here is that if students are to have important agency in the governance of this, it goes well beyond only questions of data privacy, but it actually also becomes a question of who gets to use the data, what happens with this data, what kind of algorithms are developed, for what purposes, for what futures. An important part of that is that the temporality, spatiality, and also impact are most often not possible to predict at the time of data production as well. So when we produce the data, we might not know what would happen with it in 5 years' time or so. So just to conclude here, some thoughts. What we want to suggest here is that this period of the digital economy is not, a sort of disrupted kind of approach, but it has its long path dependency, and the role and the way how we see students is always connected, not just with the how universities are governed, but how universities are seen in society, what roles they play, and how they're connected with the economy. And it seems, that we see this shift from them being sort of rebels and then accepted as partners to being then moved and understood as consumers and intensified consumers, and now almost being digital users and data producers, where we fear we might see a fall of agency even further. There is a tension in this governing with data and of data that we see as a useful way of thinking about this, where in the governance of data, there might be evidence of a potential loss of student voice and representation, as well as other stakeholders. So our question is if students are being used as data subjects and data producers rather than being seriously engaged in higher education governance in these new ways. I'm perhaps conscious of time, so Rille, if you have anything to add.
No, I think we've covered most of all of those important points, and I think it would be time for some questions.
Thank you both. Thank you, Janja, and thank you, Rille. There is a lot of interest in this, and we had good registrations, we have good participation, and a lot of Q&A. So let's get straight to it. What I'm going to do when we're about halfway through the Q&A is take a bunch of questions together and ask you to make a reply at the end, because we don't have time to do an individual Q&A with everyone who's queued up. But let's take some individual Q&A first. Diana Lorelei, can I ask all questioners to be very careful to be brief, please? We have a lot of people who want to talk.
I will. Well, thank you very much, both of you, for extremely interesting analyses there and very important ones. And my original question was that I was asking if this recognition of student rights and views as consumers doesn't just confine them to being part of a mass industry and mass consumer industry, and not the kind of client industry that higher education was always meant to be, where we are nurturing the individual to be whatever they can become. That in itself doesn't give them any political voice. They had that to some degree when they first began to be involved in governance back in the 90s. But they no longer have that kind of powerful voice, and their protests over tuition fees had no effect on anybody at all except the Liberal Party, really. So they have no voice. And now, as you pointed out, as digital users, they are entirely passive, actually. I mean, that interpreting that data, it's very crude data. The way that data is collected is for the convenience of the producers and the technologists and so on. It's not attempting to find out what students actually believe or need or want. And there can often be misunderstandings the way in which that's being used. So I was going to ask you if you didn't think that sort of thing was very important, but in fact you have said exactly that. The question now is, what role should students be able to play in governance in universities that overcomes that diminution of their political power?
It's a very good question, and it's incredibly helpful comment as well. And that's exactly the line of thoughts we have been thinking about, the ways in which, you know, students are kind of almost forced into those roles throughout that produces that passivity throughout the decades then. But yes, it's interesting that with our thought process, we haven't really been thinking about you know, the ideal solutions. We've been quite pessimistic in what we've been thinking and writing about. But I guess we need to, I think above all, is the recognition of what are the ways in which students are then, you know, the student data or student input influences decision making. I think that would be the first step we would actually have to look into, because I'm not sure that students even know that, and us within the sector. So I think that's where we need to start at, and then looking into what kinds of effects those different mediums have, which one of them have any effect whatsoever. So yeah, so that would be my quick answer. I don't know, Janja, if you want to add here.
Yes, thanks, Diana. I agree, very helpful comment. But just to say that, you know, this difference between student as user versus student as student is also an important element of that is, you know, just the platform logic versus the pedagogy logic. So, you know, what is the actual intention behind if platforms are used with the platform logic as opposed to this kind of education and education purpose. So that is really important element of that, and as you said, the political voice is yet another layer, and I think this is exactly right. I mean, that's the point and effect we do need to highlight and consider a bit more. But I would like to add, though, that I'm thinking quite a lot about the potential of democratic governance of data, which is quite a big issue across the economic and social sectors. And there are authors that are proposing solutions of how we could think about that. Some authors we already had on the PowerPoint. So Salome Viljoen talks about relational data governance, and Katarina Pistor proposes a more democratic ways of data syndicates or data commons and so on. So where we as a society would have a serious conversation and rule over the collected data instead of that being enclosed and privatized. So I'm trying to think through how this would look like in higher education, being especially challenging also with the international and global dimension, you know, but these are the big questions that are at this very moment being sort of thought through and analyzed. And it's important that higher education is part of this conversation so that, you know, it's not left out as it has its specifics.
Very good. Thank you both.
I'll have to ask you to be as briefer if you can, questioners and answerers. Fiona Ross, please.
Thank you. Great talk. Thank you both. I was surprised about your notion of student as partner in relation to your period one in the welfare state. Having sort of done quite a lot of policy work in the welfare state, I sort of see it as a paternalistic or sort of introduction of ideas where, you know, patients and indeed students were quasi recipients of goods, whether that's education or health. Certainly my own experience and of being a baby boomer and a student in the 70s, yes, there was protest, and yes, that did drive certain changes, and we saw, you know, Gordon Brown becoming a student rector at Edinburgh University, but Scotland had a very different governance model. So really my question for you is, what's the evidence and assumptions behind your assertion of students having agency in that first period that you looked at? Thank you.
Thank you. So this is an incredibly useful comment, and to be completely honest, the first period is something that we've been struggling most in terms of trying to, what kind of language and discourse to use there. So we completely agree with the notion of partner, but I think what we tried to do so far, and actually later on maybe you can, you know, have a conversation with us in terms of what kind of terminology you would use. But what we try to do is that in none of those phases we actually argue that students necessarily are partners or are consumers or are digital users as such. What we try to do is that looking into how they're constructed through that. So we try to kind of almost how that notion is imposed on them. So I think that's what we try to do, that by gaining some representative functions, it could be argued that they could be seen as partners. I don't know if it makes sense, but in terms of the discourse that is imposed on them rather than using that discourse. But yeah, so I don't know, Janja, if you want to come in here quickly, but no.
Let some more people in.
Yes.
Ron Barnett, please.
Tremendous session. Thank you very much. Observation and a suggestion. My observation is that students started before the 1960s. They actually went back about 900 years or more. This is important for your analysis. How do we understand the students before 1960? What I think, fitting in with your analysis, you could say that the students were voiceless or invisible. Now, coming up to now, that my suggestion is that you shouldn't be using the language of student as a user of data, but rather as an unwitting supplier of data. In other words, they have been rendered back to where they were in the Middle Ages. They have gone from subject to object in the last 10 years.
So just to answer the second bit, students are seen as users of digital platforms and in this sense data producers. So not students as users of data in the sense we try to present it. And about the first bit of the question, the reason why we started with the Second World War is because at least in the literature of the welfare state, this is seen to be the most kind of agreed upon start that we can think about conceptualizing the welfare state. And we obviously realize universities existed before in different models and how they were sort of voiceless in this sense. But this is the period where at least this partnership arrangement started to appear, where the ideas of universities as partners was built. So that was our rationale in this first period.
Thanks to all of the questions and answers. This is a very interesting topic, isn't it? Now, I want to bring in a group of questions because we've only got a few minutes left. The first one will be Zach Spire, and then we'll have Victorita Triff. Zach.
Good morning, colleagues. Thank you for this amazing presentation. My question is focused on the point Janja made about spatiality and temporality, and just how you see that influencing what Professor Barnett just raised about the political, and Professor Laura, the political and social dimensions affecting how you construct students. Thank you.
Okay, that's the first question. Keep it in mind. Next, Victorita Triff, please.
Hi, thank you, Simon. Congratulations for both speakers. I want to ask how to create a good balance between digital support and independence in higher education. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Victorita. Camille Candico-Housen, please. Camille.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the talk and the kind of frameworks that you're laying out. But what I was interested in, how do you see the role of students in the regulatory system fitting in? This is kind of a particularly English question. So, I mean, more broadly in the UK, students had been on, QAA panels, which, kind of reviewed the arrangements in universities. Under new arrangements, that's changed. And now there's an OFS student panel, which I would say is largely performative rather than functional. And how do you sort of see that role in the regulatory sense, also shifting into now a more digital capacity, with students sort of just becoming their feedback becoming just sort of numbers that feed into things like TEF and rankings, which can influence the kind of regulatory system. So I guess it's kind of another layer to your analysis. Thank you.
Thanks, Camille. Sam Edwards is next. Sam.
Yes, I think my question is covered by Camille, so I will pass that and save some time.
Thanks, Sam. Se-Yong Lee, please.
Thank you, Simon. My question was about student agency, and the previous discussion has already covered it very much, but I'd like to ask another question then. I wanted to ask how the discourse was imposed, not being used by the students. I mean, how do these different discourses and development of the discourses has restricted or enabled student agency practice throughout this periodical development? Thank you.
Thanks, Se-Yong. Ellen Yang.
Hello, thank you very much for the talk. I found that really inspiring. I'm just thinking about the idea of digital users in the context of the recent reports published by OFS in terms of the issues of digital poverty. So I wonder, in your perspective, do you think there's any intersection between the ideas of students being the consumers and now transforming to the users of the university services, while there might be underlying social issues of poverty as well?
Thanks, Ellen. I think we can squeeze in Hongwei if you're still there, Hongwei. Here he comes.
Rille, for your presentation. My question is, with an increasingly competitive graduate jobs market and the rising cost of higher education, what is causing universities to rethink the whole student journey? Thank you.
I think we better stop the questions there. There's a couple more. We'll give you both enough time to reply as you see fit. So I don't know who wants to start. Please feel free to choose.
Yeah, I'll start with Camille's question, which I think relates to some of those others. And I think it would be incredibly interesting to actually look into all of the changes in student role in governance through those regulatory mechanisms, because I think my instinct is, and what work we have been doing, is that that's exactly where you start seeing the intersection of those different constructs. That if you look into those Q&A panels, you probably see some of that kind of the partnership discourse that was built on much earlier, reflecting into those things. Then you look into the OFS and you see that very strong consumer discourse. And then that relates to Ellen's question to a certain extent as well. There's some of those reports and that very much work around the metrics and also the kind of the, I guess, the social issues around that as well. So I wonder whether if you look into the regulations in the English system, we probably would see those different discourses competing, the old and the new, and nothing is properly kind of formed in a way.
Okay, so I'll make a comment that I think will answer a big part of several questions, in that technology is often portrayed as neutral, but there is ample research evidencing that digital platforms and algorithms are by far from neutral. They are very much political. They have structural affordances that make people do particular things. They have rules, they make recommendations of a very particular kind that have very real material consequences. So they are not neutral devices and tools, and therefore it matters how they are created, who creates them, to whom are they accountable, and whether this is transparent or not. If this is all done privately and governed by commercially sensitive contracts, we lose this democratic oversight and a chance of influence. So I think that the discourse behind here is that is all focused on personal data privacy, but it's not focused on these more fundamental questions that lie on the intersection of the infrastructural, technological, financial, and political dimension. in this sense, I think that students and other stakeholders, including staff, would need to be taken more seriously at the institutional and system level to think with the regulators about how to govern the production and then the implementation and use of such, not only data, but platforms in general, so that you know, the algorithms become kind of more transparent and that people actually have influence, that the terms and conditions can be more selective, so that not as users we either have to agree to all of it or we can't use the platform, but there's actually some kind of choice and a chance of more democratic governance along the lines of the work of authors that I mentioned before. You're muted, Simon.
My apologies. Is there anything further you want to add in response to the questions?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Just about the student agency, which I thought was a really good question as well. And I think that echoes in ways which we have been looking into those hegemonic constructs of students in the governance, but it's actually incredibly important then to also look into the ways in which students would take on those different types of constructs and how they actually enact those roles. And that's my other parts of work that I've actually looked into how, and that goes back to Professor Barnett's comment as well, that in some ways some of my work has looked into how students can revolt through consumer rights as well. So it's not necessarily that they don't have agency, but their agency may have been transformed within those hegemonic constructs as well. So I think that's the kind of the balance between the dominant discourse and the student as well.
Thanks, Rille. Thank you, Janja. I'd like to bring it to a close now, but thank you very much for today's topic and today's presentation. It strikes me that, and I've now chaired about 70 webinars in the last year or so, that, you know, the way you developed your slides in a really both simple and deep way, I thought that really worked and engaged people very, very well. Also, the references to history were a good starting point. I think that kind of brought everyone in quite well. But, you know, I do hope you produce a CG working paper. We routinely ask our webinar presenters to prepare a working paper on the basis of their presentations, but I think there'd be a lot of interest in this if you could do that, and I'll write to you formally about that, but we'd really welcome that. And we welcome having you both back on this and other topics. It's of great interest what's happening to students. It's always of interest what's happening to students as consumers and as digital subjects and objects, and that discussion, I think, is not one that'll ever end, but it's one where where you know, you're contributing very markedly to it. So thank you. Our next webinar is from Juliette Tarabian, who's from the University of Luxembourg, and she's going to talk about access and widening participation in a kind of broader context, and that webinar will be next Tuesday. She's called it the Cinderella Syndrome, Revisiting Access and Widening Participation on a cross-country basis. So look forward to seeing everyone then. And don't forget the CG conference, which is coming up. Trevor's been telling you about that in the chat. We've already had about 350 registrations. We're looking forward to a very inclusive and exciting conference. So keep an eye on that. That'll be on the 11th and 12th of May. Thank you again, Rille and Janja, and good luck with your work in future. Bye for now.
Thank you, Simon, and everyone.
Thank you.